Hi, I'm Valen, and here we are again for episode 2 of Adapting Percy Jackson. We're right here on the north shore of Long Island. It's very pretty here, but it's December and it's very cold. Let's just get into it. This is called I Become One with the Plumbing. Enjoy. In the last episode, I went into great detail on the foundational elements for this video series, and the script went into great detail on the foundation of our world and characters. We have the relationships of Percy and Grover set very firmly in stone. Percy and his mom are shown to have a very deep bond, only for her to be taken away in the blink of an eye, and Percy is thrust into this whole new world with little time to adjust. So, where do we go from here? We open on Percy's blurry and semi-conscious perspective, with a young blonde girl standing above him. She asks him a bunch of rapid-fire questions that Percy doesn't answer as he falls back unconscious. Round 2, he briefly wakes up to see the many-eyed security for camp, Argus, sitting nearby and stringing up the Minotaur horn. Then enters a woman who Percy recognizes as Mrs. Kerr. There's a lot to be said about this already. Clearly, this is a deviation from what happens in the novel. Mrs. Kerr was the substitute that replaced Mrs. Dodds after her disappearance. So how and why is she here? Something I spent an inordinate amount of time on in preparation for writing this series was trying to mechanically make sense of the magic system known as the Mist. In the ancient myths, the Mist is a cloak over reality that the gods wield to hide things from the mortals. In the Percy Jackson books, it initially isn't explained much further than it obscures the vision of humans. But how, and to what extent? They go on to further explain additional mechanics such as clear-sighted mortals and mist manipulation, but each new ability appears to add more confusion than the last. In the first episode, we can see this used to cover a lot of magical happenstances, but the most prominent of them all has to be the replacement of the defeated Alecto as their math teacher. The entire school forgot about her existence, and instead they remember a Mrs. Kerr, who mysteriously arrives after she disappears. This, from a meta standpoint, is done to portray Percy as potentially seeing things with his imagination. But what does that actually mean, to replace a human being like that with magic? You would need magic that can satisfy a few requirements. The first is physical manipulation, hiding Alecto from Grover and Chiron, obscuring the true form of weapons, monsters, and magical creatures from humans, etc. This one is pretty much the baseline power of the Mist: hide from the mortal gaze that which they can't comprehend. Of course, what determines something they can't comprehend is another conversation as well. The next is memory manipulation, the ability to warp the human's view of reality after it happens. This is shown most plainly when Chiron alters the body of Yancey Academy's memories to make them believe that Mrs. Kerr was always the school's designated 6th grade pre-algebra teacher. Now, if that sounds like a moral quandary to you, we haven't even gotten to the worst part yet. Full control over a mortal's autonomy. Now, I don't claim to know exactly how Mrs. Kerr appeared at this field trip. However, according to Percy, he's never seen her before in his life, and she doesn't look anything like the Mrs. Dodds we knew pre-monster transformation. So who is this woman? Is she a physical manifestation of the power of the Mist? Because that doesn't sound absolutely broken. Was she just a normal mortal walking along the side of the road to perform her daily errands when Chiron just decided to yoink her mind and agency to hide the truth from Percy? Imagine being you, going about your day when suddenly your entire life changes its trajectory in an instant because someone wanted to use you as a prop for maintaining their lie. You are not you anymore. You're the pre-algebra teacher for a boarding school upstate. And mind you, she is at the school for the remainder of the year. By Percy's account, she is a real flesh and blood teacher. So who is she? There isn't an easy answer for that without some super messed up magic voodoo or illusion that jumps down a major rabbit hole of morally questionable decisions on the part of Chiron or Grover. So how did I end up justifying it? I made it a plot point. Mrs. Kerr apparently works at Camp Half-Blood, and the explanation for that will come around later in the episode. For now, Percy wakes up and sees her, then freaks out, thinking this is the Mrs. Dodds fiasco starting all over again. However, he's too weak to walk and collapses instantly. He wakes up for the final time with Grover next to him, working on some musical notation for a spell of some sort. We introduce nectar and ambrosia as medicine of the gods, showing that they are capable of healing demigods and also have the potential to kill if taken too liberally. Percy notices the Minotaur's horn and breaks down in tears as the emotions all come flooding back. We give the scene a minute to breathe, then come back to Percy going outside and seeing Grover with his goat legs, remembering his true form. A centaur, who is revealed to be Mr. Brunner, enters and introduces himself as
Chiron. teacher of man, trainer of heroes, and activities director here at Camp Half-Blood.
They have a walk and talk where Chiron explains the state of the world generally, then brings him into an old classroom to explain in detail the world they come from. We dive into the backstory of the gods as it's told in the old stories. My goal was to ensure there were opportunities to actually show some of these events and engage the audience in a way that more than simply explaining it ever could. We would zoom into the table Chiron's using as illustration for the lecture, then transition to a stylized flashback of the actual events, showing quick excerpts of the myths from Cronus betraying and killing Uranus to Metis crafting the emetic for Zeus, then sequences of the long and bloody Titanomachy. And then where most of the stories stop, we continue on, adding new material to the canon. After the fall of Troy, the world began to change. This was a part of my long-standing plan to create mechanics for the story that would allow for an internal logic to the mist. This powerful magic that controls much of how people view the world and can be manipulated by those strong enough to wield it. I'll detail the full timeline and reasoning behind each world-building choice when we get to the development video, but the important thing to hone in on here is that the mist was once only used as a tool by the gods, but at one point was dropped like a shroud over all of mankind, separating the godly and mortal realms forever. This began an age of godly rule without the worship of the mortals. New gods were made, and the ancient world eventually fell into myth, but the influence of the gods still remained through the existence of what they called the Flame of the West, in each beautiful and messy form it took. Ultimately, Chiron drops the bomb that the gods are real and have been living right above them this whole time, and then the equally shocking bomb that Percy's father is one of them, making him a demigod, or as they describe them at camp, a half-blood. And of course, with how many drastic measures they took to keep this secret from Percy, there must be a really good reason for keeping all this from him for so long. Right? In the books, the secrets are justified as a protection method against monster attacks. So after Dodds attacked, they tried to hide it from him with the mist as a band-aid solution, hoping he would think it was just a bad dream or hallucination. So by now it should be obvious that the rules surrounding the mist need to be very clear in order to have the stakes function. We need to know how the mist affects different groups of people, what the exceptions are, and where one can cross over the line from one group into another. All I did to this aspect of the story was solidify the rules and dub the intermediary phase when a demigod becomes able to use the powers and see through the mist as waking up. This dialogue about Percy's father being a god also strengthens the notion that Grover and Chiron had frequent contact with Sally without Percy's knowledge, giving Percy more of an indication that there was more to his mother than meets the eye. We run through a lot of exposition here, which should come as no surprise to anyone that's read the book. Essentially, the first half of the story is setting up the premise, which means a lot of world building being force-fed down people's throats. Like before, I will always try to use distraction tactics to make the exposition feel less forced. Here, for example, we're going to be walking through the camp and experiencing everything it has to offer for the first time alongside Percy. In that time, we learn Percy's dad is a god. The gods don't always reveal their identity to their lover. The gods don't claim their children until they're ready to, which can be a long time. Some are summer campers, the more powerful ones stay year-round. Not many people can fight the Minotaur bare-handed. Percy can. Monsters regenerate from the underworld. Some leave behind relics. Chiron had a wish that was granted that allows him to become immortal. At that point, Chiron feels a shift in the wind, and they head back to the big house, where we are introduced to the camp director, Mr. D. I had a lot of fun writing him, and felt that most of his lines embodied the boredom and perturbed energy of a prisoner being asked by someone from the outside how his day is going. We go through all the classic hallmarks, of course, calling him Peter Johnson, trying to use him to fill up a wine glass for him, complaining about his tenure at camp, getting upset by his ignorance. I honestly didn't feel the need to change him too much. So much of his involvement in the script will be pretty consistent with the book. And at long last, we are introduced to Annabeth, the girl with a genius intellect and the social IQ of a retracted turtle head. She introduces herself to Percy by informing him that he drools when he sleeps, then brings him along to the camp store to get some necessary supplies. They banter for a minute before Percy mentions the solstice, shining a light on this mysterious secret theft that's cast a shadow over the entire show so far. We reveal that Zeus and Poseidon have been fighting up on Olympus, that their conflict has been causing crazy weather events, and that Annabeth is waiting for something. Whatever it is, we'll have to figure out later, because she doesn't want to get into it. We go to the camp store and reintroduce ourselves to Mrs. Kerr, who is now working in the shop and is currently shooing out some baby harpies that got in. This whole bit is supposed to be comedic and weird and feel like some questions really need to be answered, so she does. Mrs. Kerr's true name is Lyra, an Ore, a wind spirit that ended up in the right place at the right time in order to help Chiron's attempt to protect Percy from the truth of his identity. identity. Finding an opportunity to provide a service for the most renowned centaur known, she jumped at the opportunity to work at camp and has been there ever since. We move right along to our first look at the cabins, getting an idea of their significance and which god belongs to each. Then as we move over towards cabin 11, we see some kids from the Ares cabin giving Percy a dirty look, with Clarice LaRue at the head. While Percy tries to brush it off, Annabeth almost leans into it here. The feelings of the Ares cabin campers are not too far off from Annabeth's own motivation here, so it felt only right that they would both have the same idea, but perhaps go about it in different ways. This also emphasizes how big of a deal Percy's defeat of the Minotaur actually was, which is totally fair in my eyes, being as there was only one of them and it was the same beast that Theseus himself defeated. But as they move into cabin 11, we get introduced to the swarm of Hermes kids and Undetermined. And of course, Luke, the head counselor. Another section of major exposition here, mostly dealing with how the Hermes cabin takes in so many and the daily lives of campers here. Later in the evening, the whole camp is gathered in the pavilion for a meal where we see all of the traditional customs being observed, from pouring libations to scraping off burnt offerings. We really begin to see Percy starting to connect with the camp in a way that he's never connected anywhere before, and at the campfire, he's seen actively enjoying himself. After the sing-along, Luke reconnects with Percy and chats him up about how he feels. We see a different, more cynical side to him this time, where he's clearly upset by the gods and their unwillingness to pay attention to their children, but it seems like he's also resigned to it at this point. He skirts around a conversation about a meeting with his father, Hermes, and they both go upstairs. He goes into a little more detail about Percy's mental image of his faults, and explains that it's simply not the case at all. His traits are what keep him alive, helped him consume the godly food, and are what allowed him to defeat the Minotaur. After a rousing speech, Luke passes him a training sword and we transition into a montage of all the activities that campers do on a daily basis. In between activities, we meet back up with Grover, who is trying to play his magical flute music but is a little bit disheartened. After some hesitance, he goes into his job as a keeper and his responsibilities to keep Percy out of danger. This is all related to his upcoming trial, which we'll get to in a bit. Percy mentioning running away at the bus station reminds him of the interaction they had with the Fates, and he explains their significance. Destiny, prophecy, you know, nothing good. Annabeth comes in and steals Percy to go to the climbing wall, where we have our next interaction with Clarice. But before that, Annabeth has a key line that stuck out to me because of its importance in explaining a key mechanic that was left virtually unexplored before. Nobody cares about safety here. Now, okay, alright, hear me out. To an extent, that is a good thing. Preparation for a real-world crisis, great. Increased motivation to succeed, that's awesome. And, you know, there are serious consequences for failure. However, I think impermanent consequences make more sense for a training environment than, I don't know, say, death? No wonder the death rate is so high among demigods. I wouldn't be surprised if the camp is getting more than the monsters are. Like, there doesn't need to be lava at the bottom of the climbing wall, but the fact that it's there shows that the camp's training style provides no wiggle room for mistakes, clumsiness, or general incompetence, of which children as well as adults have an abundance of. So, in order to circumvent this severe lack of caution, I added a line assuring that the lava pit is charmed. No permanent damage. Percy starts climbing and is confronted by Clarice, who presses him with accusations until he gets fed up and pushes back, telling her to go cry to her father. This sets her off real good, and when they both rappel down, Clarice comes after him and takes him down. She is clearly physically superior, but Percy takes a beating pretty gracefully. They end up in the bathroom when Percy again reaches a height of anger that pulls at his insides, and the plumbing of the bathroom explodes, pushing Clarice out of the room and onto her rear. In her rage, she gives him a back-to-the-future style ultimatum, letting him know that they'll finish this on the battlefield. At Friday's Capture the Flag.
Settle this then.
Annabeth is impressed with his skills, while still unsure of how he did what he did. The week goes on and we get another training scene with Luke. He gives a lesson, and afterwards Luke takes him out into his secret training area in the woods. He goes on a bit of a tirade against the gods when Percy brings up the conflict and then offers him a metal sword to replace his wooden training one. Just another small add-on to the safety measures at camp. Your counselor has to decide you're not a danger to yourself or others before ending your probationary period and giving you a real weapon. In another quick training scene, we finally see Percy doing something better than Annabeth, but he's not satisfied that the activity happens to be canoe racing. More fun bantering, and then we go into a bit of digging into who Percy's dad might be. Curiously, she leaves out the three most famous gods, and Percy prods at it. and Annabeth dips into a bit of lore about the Big Three, their involvement in World War II, and their children's very existence being forbidden. It hurts to put so much exposition in this episode, but there is genuinely so much going on in this series that it's hard to tell the difference between what's important to know immediately and what's just a fun fact, and worst case scenario, things like this can always be cut down in the edit. Again, the ability to shave down scenes in post can be an absolute godsend. Percy has a quick dream of his mother and wakes up abruptly. He decides to use the bathroom outside and walks down, but hears a noise over in the woods. He investigates it and is suddenly attacked by a Theron Draken, a standard killer monster from ancient times. He fends it off for a few minutes until it is struck dead by none other than Lyra, the wind nymph. This is certainly a little weird and may bring a little suspicion as to Lyra's true purpose in the story, but that's pretty much all we'll get from this scene other than an indication that the monster got through the barrier and Percy is being hunted. We've made it to Friday, and Percy catches up with Grover again. After his trial with the council, they've determined that Grover is in a sort of limbo status, where he hasn't really failed the mission, but since he's not succeeded either, he will remain bound to Percy. Percy decides to spill all the details about the previous night, and Grover freaks out, feeling the need to tell the Archontes, who will be explored next episode, but doesn't say anything for now because of how much Percy wants to take part and capture the flag. At last, the game begins. After Annabeth and Luke provide an overview of the game's strategy, she sends Percy on his way to the border. Percy is, of course, fairly confused by this, but left with nobody to complain to after Annabeth disappears with her invisibility cap, he goes to his spot. Clarice and her goons come out and attack him, much the same way as in the book. Percy falls into the water after getting the pulp beaten out of him, then feels a surge of power and absolutely dominates. The blue team comes across the river with the flag in hand, and they win the game. He briefly complains to Annabeth about being set up as a diversion, then suddenly a hellhound jumps out of the brush and attacks Percy. Chiron appears and stops its advance with a few well-placed arrows, but not before Percy gets roughed up a bit. A few naiads ushers Percy back into the water and his healing powers are revealed. Everyone is reasonably shocked, and he is, at long last, formally claimed by Poseidon. The trident stands glowing above Percy's confused face, and the entire camp kneels for the son of the sea god. We zoom out in an extreme perspective shift, moving up to Olympus, where Poseidon stands at the edge of the kingdom and says, "I'm so sorry, my son." Cut to black, end credits roll. This is an interesting episode to talk about because of how much happens without much actually appearing to happen. So much is accomplished in terms of setting up character foundations and motivations while also building out this world they are placed front and center in. And we even introduce a mystery element with the attack of two monsters at camp, and the ever-looming conflict brewing up on Olympus that nobody seems to want to talk about or know about. My biggest concern was always being able to get the information out while still keeping a moderate pace overall. It's a pretty long episode, but we get so many different character perspectives and can really use action, humor, and unique camera work and scene construction techniques to avoid it feeling like a drag the entire way through. Hopefully this was able to accomplish that somewhat. A lot of the mystery elements of the episode were personal additions. They were not from the book itself. I want to make something here that can answer the questions that some book fans have, myself included, and hopefully create an additional layer of drama and suspense when it comes to the reveals in the story for the newer audiences as well. When you're done reading, let me know what you thought. I can't wait for these guys to actually start going on their quest, and I hope you're all excited too. My reaction to Disney Plus's version of episode 2 will release on Evan of Illyria tomorrow, so make sure you tune into that and see what I thought of all that good stuff. But I'll send you over to Montauk Valen for a few parting words. Okay, that's it for episode 2. As you can see, we're at the lighthouse right now. It's past dark though. We weren't able to make it for the sunset, but please tune in to the next episode. Episode 3 is coming out in a week. It'll be really good. Thanks for watching. Bye. Jesus, fuck, it's cold.